right, welcome to episode 15 of What's in the Box, where we explore every week a little bit more about the Frameworks platform and uncover some things that you may not have known and drill into a little deeper. Every week, I'm on as host, Tolgar Alpagut, VP of Marketing, and with me is our founder and CTO, Marc Taccolini. Marc, how are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you.
And if you watch us on a fairly regular basis, you may notice that my background's a little different today, and that is because I'm actually in Poland for the next 3 weeks, and I can validate that by my outlet there. So I don't have the green screen up, but today we are talking about SQL Databases, Query Editor, and SQL Data Logging. And even if you are a user of our platform, I think you're going to discover some new things today with Marc. So without further ado, Marc, take it away.
Yes, thank you, Tolga. The concept is exactly to give an overview, if you're new to the platform, on the many areas we do have some sort of SQL database technology embedded on the products. But as I do that, I will show here some pieces and parts of some configuration tools that even if you are a user and you have applications around SQL databases, it's worth to do that refresh.
Okay.
So with no further, let me share my screen. So share my desktop. And for 1 second, you see my own publishing here, little twice. And now we switch to the documentation only. Okay. So we did explain in a previous video about our tag types. And one thing I'd like to start making the emphasis that we are, as far as know, one of the only few solutions where we have the tag types matching one-to-one all the database types. So if you're doing a connection in between your real-time tags and you have structures like a dates time structure in the database, or a duration of time in the database, or the standard guild identifier they use databases, even array of bytes. If we're storing some blob data, we have the .NET type equivalent to that database column. And even one that we'll explore a little bit today is called data table. The data table is the result of a query. It's literally a full table. So one thing that you need to start thinking a little more out of the box when using us, we support those advanced data types like blob types and query types that allows you to manage in tag. One tag only can be storing a full table, and that helps a lot in some KPI and dashboard applications, as we are going to see in a little bit. Okay, so going back to the product configuration. Okay, one first place that we support SQL databases, but that one is a little more hidden to you, is when we do that configuration that we have edit tag objects, or we have on edits, we have the alarm groups, and then we have the alarm items. Everything in our software configuration is behind the scenes a SQL database. So one thing that we are eventually going to explore in the future is that allows you to do very good tracking applications, showing what are changing in the project configuration, and also doing some automation, creating those configuration types through codes. Do you have my audio okay, Tolgar?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, good. It was so quite a nice. It was too good to be true. Anyway, not for today, but keep in mind this basic concept that when you are doing a Factory Studio project configuration, this extension file, tproj, its configuration is stored in one of those files. This file is exactly a SQLite encrypted SQL database. So when we need to do things like merging projects or keeping track on what are changing in your application, or we do have some tools that you can create or modify that project configuration on the fly. The runtime application, the application itself can modify its configuration file on external application driving. So we do have, because our own configuration file is a SQL database, okay?
Okay.
But moving to the application itself, where you use SQL, I would start here with this module called Datasets. On datasets, you can pick up any kind of database. In this example, in this computer, we have OGBC connections, or LEDB is the, and you can also have native clients like Oracle, SQLite, or Postgre. And those are the data providers that are installed in this computer. We do have a XAML configuration file. For instance, we have a XAML configuration file for Firebirds or to Sybase. So if you need a connection with a database that's not listed in this table, you have two options. You can use the OGBC or OLEDB connection. Those are generic standards that you connect with many types of data sources. Or you can reach out to us because we do have some additional custom provider connections, but we don't do by default the distribution of products because those connections, they require you to have that specific database, of course, otherwise they do not work properly. So there are some additional interfaces that you need to contact us if you are doing a connection. And if you are using Azure, no, because Azure is pretty much a SQL client for our point of view on the configuration, okay? So let me give some specific examples. So here I'm creating a connection with a SQL Server database. And then here you put the connection string. And I had a SQL database in this server computer, so it was able to connect with that database and see I have 8 tables in that database. Now, and the name of the connection, I can call provider 1, I can call MySQL data. Of course, you can call any name you want. It's an object in your application, okay? And when you have those connections established, you can go ahead and access the tables on that database. And we allow that virtualization. So the table in the database does not need to be the same table in your application. So that's really very important because what we do with the database is we create that abstraction layer that maps a table entity inside frameworks to a physical table in the database, okay? And we can do the same with queries and stored procedures. So I can define here an entity that I'm calling carry1 that will be in SQL query statements from that database. Okay, something like that. Just some example, and of course, can be very complex SQL tables. So on the basic first step on the configuration, we are just mapping those objects. And when you do that mapping, we do have many UI tools that are designed to work with tables right away. For instance, if you pick up a data grids on the objects, the data grids is a very powerful and flexible tool, because if you put here just one variable, like an integer, and you run that application, what you're going to see on the runtime are the many properties of that one tag. But if instead of that, you map the data grid to that external query data, you can see the result of the table, or you can see the result of your query in the object, not having to create one tag to each position. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So the only one catch with databases here are showing generic row 0, column 0. To be able to really make the connection, run the queries, you need to put your application in test modes or startup modes. Okay. One thing that's very useful is to put the application in test modes. Okay. Because when you run in test modes, you have some built-in protections, as you see here. For instance, my databases, I am accessing with the read-only attributes. So it's my first time running this project against that external databases. Would not be a bad idea before I start doing testing, publishing data. I run the application test mode with that built-in protection. Okay. That I'll be able to query, I'll be able to build queries against the database, but not yet accessing the data. So
I'm sorry, Marc, just quickly, is that sort of best practice in your view to do that each time?
Oh yeah, definitely. We should use that testing modes because that's not only on databases. When you run the application in test modes, you are not really yet archiving alarm and starting. Mm-hmm. The devices are reached only by default. Of course, you can modify those defaults as you are working with your application, but it's always a good start. Okay. And when you run the application in test mode, we also have some additional built-in .NET debugging flags that we use.
Got it.
So there is lots of hidden. So essentially what I did the mapping of that table on that SQL database and create here a basic view of that data. Okay.
Okay.
And also it's very important to say, oh, but I need to have the application running. Yes, you do, but keep in mind, we do have online configuration. So if you want to modify the graph, the screens, you just do as I'm doing here. And when you commit your modification, you have the result right away. So it's not because we decide to split the execution environment from the configuration environments that you cannot have both at the same time and have right away the results of your configuration. Okay.
Okay.
So And here I put in a basic data grid object, but we'll not explore too much the UI today. But keep in mind, we have many objects like the bar chart objects, the trend charts. They also can work with the result of data sets, okay?
Okay.
But I'll talk that a little bit later. Let's go back to the basic concepts. So here you saw how I create a new database connection. And you see also that even before you did that, we had already 4 database connections defined. What are those? When you create a new project, we create by default 4 database tables that your application is needing to have, okay? One is the tag SQL database where you can store your data logging. We call that tag História. One where we store your alarm history and audit trail information. One database where you store the dynamically created users for the application. And one database where we store the persistence data. By that, I mean if you pick up this tag integer and you modify the retentive property to say, okay, this tag, every time I change the database, I will want to save the value or not. So if you modify that property, you be able to have that data. And a very typical question, you see right now this feature is read only. Because some of the configurations that we cannot apply immediately, we need to have some sort of hot start button. You cannot, we force you to be aware that the runtime is no longer connected. So you can do those modifications that will require an apply button and then apply to runtime. Okay. It's just a protection because if you modify this tag from type integer to type Boolean or double or date table, it can have some serious side effects in some pieces of your application. So some modifications like that one, where you are changing the tag type, or you are changing if the tag is retentive or not, or the domain, we have this step to disconnect from the running application. So you can do your tests, you can run test modes, and if you want to publish in real time, you just connect again to the application and hit a hot start button, okay? And this topic, Tolgar, was completely off SQL. we eventually need to move that segment to deploying projects, okay?
Fair point.
But I decided to share anyway, because if the people are not used with that connected and disconnected, they will, it's a very common question. They see why this field now is read only. And the answer is for your own protection.
Yeah.
So we don't do those bigger modification applications and apply immediately. Those modifications were only applied after I did that hot start button, okay?
Okay.
But they were applied with the application running, okay? Is the application running, so it's good. You don't need to stop and start, okay? But let's keep it moving. So by default, when you create a new project, we create those 4 SQL database files, and you see here the name of the file. So by default, you're going to save your alarms and your data logging in this database file that has the name of your projects and is located on the same folder. So __ execution path and name is a macro in our product just say pick up the current project's name and the current path of that project. And it will be by default our archives for the data logging, okay? So in that case, if I go to the folder, I will find a file called project3.story, okay? But let's say I want to do my data logging in the SQL database, not on the tag story, okay? How I do that? I just create one more connection to the SQL database, or I can even rename those connections. So this tag story now, I'm renaming this connection to tag story and backup. It will not be no longer my tag story. And this one now will be my tag story. So just by renaming the predefined connections, now I'm putting the tag story to that SQL database, okay?
Okay.
And if I want to have the alarms also on that database, that's the same thing. I just create a new connection and pointing the alarm historian that is a predefined object to the same SQL database, okay? So now those two tables, when running this application, be archived in the SQL, not in the SQLite. Okay.
Okay.
That means everything we do on the product regarding tag store and alarm store and or even your custom connections, if you have some recipe or some KPI data, you can see you can very easily connect with any kind of database. But when using that object in your application, you don't care which database it's from. Because you see, when I did my display, I did the mapping with the entity datasets.table.myTable1. And my table 1 is defined here to whatever name in my target database. So if I decide to change a lot this application, pointing this table 1 to be from another name in the database, or I change from a production database to a test database, I don't need to change the application because the application is using this virtual object here, okay? We don't care if my table 1 is pointing to SQL, to Postgre, to SQLite, because the application is calling the query for my table 1, whatever that my table 1 is using, okay? So one thing that we did that's very powerful in the application, if you're showing the full table here, or if you are creating a condition to that table to get the data only where column A equal 4, or to get the data, use the curly bracket syntax. You're going to get the data only when column A equal the contents of this tag. Is how you do dynamic queries in your application, by the way. Those queries, they will work no matter what database you are using. It's pretty much the same concept. So you can really have a very high abstraction layer with whatever database you are using, okay?
Okay.
So far, so good.
Yeah, I'm following along here.
Yes, in this example, we are mapping to show a full table in my UI. How I can do if instead of showing only the full table, I want to insert or pick up specific rows from the external database, okay? One way to do that, we have this project example in our support sites called Get Data from GB. Explain one of the ways of doing that. So in this small projects, which by the way is not running. So let me put this project to run, and I'm change the port number so it will not conflict with the other projects I have to run in this computer. So in this little example, all what you are doing is allowing the data grids object itself to drive the user interface. So let me show the configuration and what's happening here. So what we did in this case, we map to the data grid a full table, but when you select here in a combo box or list box, we pick up all the specific fields for that item. In this case, we are doing that filtering in the display itself. So in this application, we are not changing the query. What we did in this application, we are mapping to the full employee table, and we have that built-in property called selected values that you can map automatically to the selected row on the database. That's what we're doing here. So when you create that display, this was the employee.name, one column of the database. This was the employee.id, but who is mapping the employee tag is not on the query, is directly on the UI through those selected values, okay?
Okay.
Another way, sometimes, instead of doing that, you want to customize the query itself. That's where you do that syntax here. So if I want to do a query that will return only one row, I can do something like that. I do the query where employee name equal Marc, okay? Or you can replace tag Marc by an input field in your application where the user types which employee he wants to search, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So what's important to understand, those queries, even we have a configuration for them, they are decided when the application are running, okay? And if you use this variable here, if you do a proper, more real-life application, I'm going to create a variable called tests. I'm going to say this variable is domain client. It means each computer accessing this application will have their own value. And I'll put here, I'll create this tag with the name selected name, okay? And I can create a combo box or use interface, or I can read from any place what will be that query at that given time to that client computer. So if you do that in your work conditions, and now when you run that query, when running the application, you are going to return only one row or only a few rows where that work condition is satisfied, okay?
Okay.
If it be one row. And assuming that's only one row, if you want to map the results of that query directly to tags, not having to have the data grids, that's why we have this mapping tool. So the mapping tool allows you to say, okay, after you run that query, you are going to pick up, hold on, instead of provider one, let's go back to this database where I have real data. So I can give a more interesting example. Now I have columns, okay?
Okay.
So here I'm saying that when I run that query, I'm going to pick up the result of column integer 3 in the database, and automatically maps the tag integer 3. Of course, if they're pretty much the same, you allow you copy and paste. You don't need to do typing one by one. But this concept of map is important because sometimes you may want to map a column in the database to another variable or another data model in your application. So not necessarily your properties in your application and the columns database will match. Okay.
Okay.
Unfortunately, most of the times they won't match. So this concept of mapping allows you to do also translation. So when write to the database, I pick up this variable and write to this column. When reading from the database, I pick up the contents of this column and put on this tag. Okay. So the mapping is whatever you are reading and whatever you are writing to that database. And a question that I always have now, but how you do the commands to read or how you do the command to write? Well, if you are using that query in a data grid, in some visual objects, you don't need to do anything because when we need to display that object, we'll run the query. But if you want to insert data, or if you want to do queries to use on the map scripting for times to times, you access that, like everything in our product, through the object name. So this configuration here is under Datasets, Tables, My Table 1. This query is under Datasets, Query 1. So if I want to run a script every 2 seconds, okay, or in reaction to these user commands, okay, how you do that? Again, go to the same object model used all over the products. You go to namespace datasets.
Okay.
And under the namespace dataset, you have tables. And then you have your tables and the properties you can access from that table, okay? And in fact, I will do through here because the IntelliSense, it's going too quick to the visual transmission. So I can do through here. So I pick up the object, dataset, table, table 1. And this object has a bunch of properties. So guess what the property insert will do? It will insert a new row in that database.
Okay.
What the property insert executed means, it will a flag that will be set after your insert was executed. What the proper last status message means, I think you can guess that one.
Yeah.
So when you are doing updates, a select or insert in the database, you pretty much use those properties or methods in your code. So when you set the property insert to 1 or we change its value, you are triggering a behind the scenes process to do insert. Or if you call insert commands, we do that right away. So when doing the transactions with the database, we can also do through a command that you do the operation right away, whatever is a insert, a delete, or run a store procedure, or you can set through the properties, changing the property that will trigger the execution in the background, okay?
Okay.
And I know some of those concepts, they are a little advanced when you're in the beginning. I'm running the background or the foreground, but in this video, I just want to make you aware we have those things. when you need to use in a more advanced application that you are struggling with performance, if doing synchronous, you remember that there's these additional tricks inside, okay?
Okay.
So today is not planned to be a full training, but to let you know, okay, we have this, we have that, and then you can research further in your documentation, custom examples. But anyway, going back to the concept of data sets, what I did explain for table is pretty much the same for queries. The only difference, the queries, you can mix data from many tables, but it's read only. The table, you can read or write, but it's from one single table, okay? And queries is how you call also storage procedures. And we'll not really have much time to go into the detail, but there is one thing very complex when you do SQL application, that's to prevent a SQL injection. So you must be very careful because depends on how you allow people to do queries. It's a typical backdoor to bypass the security of our SQL database. And we can cover that later through the questions or we put in our forum. But we did specific protections in our products to prevent SQL injection when doing applications around SQL databases, okay? But anyway, so the concepts of SQL and query are pretty much the same. And you just use that objects in any place of your application. And I'll give one more example here in the code editor. There is a very important .NET type called data table. So data table is a .NET object that holds a set of data. So if I want, for instance, do a more advanced application, I can read in this command, I'm doing a reading from the contents from the SQL database, and I brought that to a local .NET variable. So what I'm doing from now on is not Factory Studio anymore. It's .NET programming. So what I'm doing here, I'm doing an interaction in each one of that rows of that database, and I'm getting the contents of what they have in that row in my variables to do whatever I want to do with that, okay? So let's try to do something here that it's not very nice, but why not? Here I'm creating one string that has all the names in that query plus some new line space. So in this little code example, I'm creating a .NET code that will create a variable that has all the names I could find in that query. Okay, just very simple example to show that you can use the results of that right away, or you can also do things not only in codes, but using our tags also. If I create a tag that's of type database, it can hold the result of that string. Go ahead, Tolgar. I think you had a question.
Just in terms of what you've got there, how different does that look when you switch from C# to VB.NET? And is there any considerations that you need to take into account?
Not really.
Nothing.
I just did.
Yeah.
Yeah. You see the way they do the concatenation of strings, the syntax for each command may be a slight difference.
Okay.
But other than that, it's exactly the same, the concept, whatever language you are. Good. So essentially, what you can do with the data sets by the way, are not covered today because it was outside scope, but the data sets is also where we define access to XML files.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you need to read and write from XML files, that's a piece of configuration you can do on data sets as well. But let me start a new project to go to another topic. Okay. Oh, and you asked about VB, but you can access that data from Python as well.
Okay. So all three.
Because
Okay.
remember, everything in our product is an object. So the same way a tag is an object, the result of a query is also an object.
Yeah.
So
sense.
we can access from any of our programming language. You can access from any place in your application. In fact, if we go to our demo application, the demo project, we have a few screens that we have those kind of performance dashboards, okay? And if you want to see a good example on how the use of those data structures can simplify, you can use our own demo projects. Because when you were creating the demo, to do those charts, we are not using 10, 20 tags here. That's only one tag of type data table. So to do many of the simulations we have in our demo project, so that's a configuration for the demo projects, okay? Let me switch the color schema so it'll be easy to recognize. So in this configuration, if I go to my data sets, you see when we did that demo, we defined a few tables and a few queries from a simulation database that we had to power the demo. For that OE data, we had to send some archives to populate the demo. But it was very easy to do because you see here, we create tags of type data table. And if I run the cross-reference for that variable, you see how easy it was to create the demo. Because what we did was here in that one line of code, we are populating this tag, which is a data table tag, with a data table we created in .NET. So we create a table structure with some simulated data. And instead of having 10, 20, 50 tags, we create this data table tag. And this data table tag does not care at all if I have 2 rows, 3 rows, 10 rows, because it's a table. It can hold as many rows I decide to put on my simulation. And when doing the user interface, we are mapping that to that row tag, okay? The color schema here was not the best I see for the data show. But essentially, when you did the mapping of the variable, you can see here, you are mapping to the table. So when I run this application, if I have 2 rows, 10 rows, 20 rows, I don't care. It's still one tag in our real-time database. Okay.
Okay.
Good. And one last concept that I'd like to put here on the table is, so on data sets, we pretty much, we define those custom connections with your SQL style databases. But let's explore a little bit more about the built-ins that we have, specifically alarm storing and tag storing. So alarm storing, when you define here the alarm groups, you have that log events. So log events will define if when the alarm go active, when go back to normal, or which events you want to store based on the group of that alarm. So you don't do that tag by tag, you do that putting your tags connect with a configuration group. And same for audit trail, you just need to enable what you want to store. You don't need to define here where we are going to save that data, because that data is always going to be saved to whatever database is the alarm historian database. So whatever is SQLite or Oracle or Azure, if you modify the connection string to the alarm historian, will automatically refer to that other database to save the alarm data. Okay?
Okay.
And that's the same for our built-in tag historian. As you know very well, we have a very good partnership with some companies that work specifically in process historians, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So we really like the idea, if you're doing large enterprise applications, to work with us, combine it with some other tools. For instance, we just put out a very nice native integration with Canary Labs. But we do have also our built-in data logging based in SQL. And then depends on the performance requirements, the number of the tags can be definitely quite useful. For instance, in this project, we are using our built-in story to log some performance benchmarks like CPU, memory of our own process as I run the application. And we create a little default display in HTML5 showing that information. Okay, whatever that is that page, and so
I've got a
going back
question
to
for you too, Mark.
Go ahead.
I'm going to pop it up on the screens from Shivendo. He just said, "What is
Okay.
best practices of Shivendo? Are you asking what is best practices of Factory Studio, or is there something more specific?"
Yeah, best practice on using Factory Studios is a little bit too generic. What I can tell you, some best practices regarding SQL in general. I would say that you should use a lot of virtualization capability that we have, and you should avoid to access, to do .NET coding, access the tables directly. If it's possible, .NET, you don't need our dataset module to do database access. If you're doing C# and VB.NET, there are some low-level APIs that allows you to database access. But the problem when you do that, you don't have the lots of protections and easier syntax, SQL injection projection that you have when you use our datasets.
Okay.
So,
and Mark,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. He elaborated. He said data logging. That's what he's looking for. Yep. So.
And when you go to the data logging, you must understand the two ways you have to do data logging. That's in fact part of that was what's planning to do now is to explain that and how you organize your configuration to maximize for performance. Okay. Because the main bottleneck when you compare the built-in SQL data log that we have with a native story is, of course, on the performance on storing the data and when recovering the data. And it's very hard to give you a magic number because it depends on how you do your configuration, the hardware. You can be amazingly different numbers on that. So I give you the principles, but not exact the numbers. So what are that should be aware? When you do data logging using our own tool, first of all, you have the ability to select where you are going to do. So SQLite is good to small projects, a few hundreds. When you start to go to thousands, you should think about. And that's why you allow also to do like SQL, Azure, Oracle or Postgre. So the first recommendation, based on the size of our application, even using our built-in SQL database, you may consider, instead of SQLite, a more robust provider for the database.
Mark, let me piggyback on that real quick because we just got a question, and I think you kind of touched on it. But Alexander's asking from which size of the project tags logging is it better to not use the built-in database? Is there a specific number that you'd say?
Well, it's very hard to say because I say if you have 50,000 tags and plus that are doing data logging, I can say it's very, very likely you should be using a store. Okay. But if you put the question, oh, what about 5,000? Depends. You can do a configuration using SQL that was created with the proper optimization the SQL will handle or not. And one benefit, by the way, I was having that discussion with the Canary workshop 1 week ago. One good thing about the storing tool, try to sell them a little bit their concepts. you don't need to worry about what I'm going to explain now. You don't need to understand how you are saving the data and which table the data is doing, because they work with binary data and they try to solve that optimization problem with you. So how far, in terms of size, a configuration with SQL can go depends on how much we need to invest the time to understand a good way to set up your SQL tables and set up your queries so you can manage them properly. You see the difference?
Yeah.
Not only put everything there without understanding how you're organizing the data. And when you are organizing the data in our product, the first thing you need to understand is there are two ways to organize the data. We have one database schema that essentially you have one column for the date time, okay? And the date time, it can be up to milliseconds. Okay, here I'm putting something more simple, just an explanation. So one table schema that we have is every time that we insert one row, we insert all tags on that row. And not necessarily we are going to insert the quality also. We have, if you don't need the quality data, you save some time not even archiving that. And when you do that kind of optimization, you need to group your tags that they have more or less the same rate you want their archival. And also tags that are very likely that you want to show together in your graphical UI. Because if those three tags, they are part of the same UI, when I do a query for those three tags, it will be quite efficient because I'm querying only one table. If those three tags, they are in different tables, I'll have to query 3 different tables to be able to do my UI. You see how you can do some optimization? And we also have another type of table that's called normalized table. In this kind of normalized table, we don't have many tags in each row. Though what we do have in a normalized data table, you have one column that's the date time, and we have another column that's the tag name. It's not exactly like that, but I'm simplifying, okay? So you can understand the concepts. So here you can also have a table that has only 3 columns. And when you archive the data, we archive the data something like that. So the first row has the value of this tag. The second row has the value of this other tag. Then the third row may have, again, the value for tag 1. Okay. So which of those 2 ways to save the data do you think is the best one, Tolgar?
I'm not sure if I have the right answer on this one.
Yeah, and I'm happy you don't have, because there isn't a right answer. It was a catch. Because depends on how your data is changing and how you want to organize your data. So if I have three variables, they don't change very frequently, and they change not when this tag change, this one will not change. Okay. If I have those variables, they don't change frequently, and the change of this one has nothing to do with the change of that one, make lots of sense organized like that. Because I'm just creating a few rows when the data has a new value. If I was to use the other schema, when this type has a new value, I have to save all three of them. Okay. But if I work with a recipe or a data that's connected from the same equipment, or data that is related, I want to save a timestamp of all that data anyway, makes more sense the other type of table. So that's why when you create a historian table in your products, you need to define some concepts that are not that easy if you not really put your time. One, if I'm using normalized tables or not. Meaning, are you using many tags on the same table, or are you going to use only one row to each tag? So when you plan for doing data log with SQL, you can create some tables that they have many columns. So in one row, I'm saving 50 tags in one row. I can create some other tables with data that change less frequent, that each tag is its own row. So to be able to properly using those settings that I will not cover in deep detail, that's for another video. But we do have some ability to do some optimizations in time that band. So even the data changes in less than 500 milliseconds will not save, or value that bands that will protect for minor deviations. We can define to save or not the data quality. So we do have some interesting optimizations on how quickly you archive and how you organize the SQL tables for maximum performance. That's why I cannot tell you the magic number. The concept is the bigger the size and the speeds, more you should do doing a proper planning, or just move to an external tool that will have the optimizations built in without you having to understand what you are doing.
Okay. So I hope that answers your question, Shuvendu and Alexander. If you guys have any additional questions, let us know.
Yeah, and of course, data log, the historian configuration, that could be a video by itself, okay? But I would say if select the proper database, the configuration for that's quite capable. We do have some customers using even SQLite in production and for their process. It's just to make sure it's well fit. And the good news, you can always change very easily. We even have some tools on our website to migrate data from SQLite to SQL Server and migrate data in between databases. So if you start an application with SQLite and then move to Postgre and then move to Azure, it's minimal change in your application, minimal.
Okay.
I think that's a big overview on datasets, Tolgar. As I told you, I was planning really to tell what we have, not go in the detail of all. And there is one thing that I forgot to show, that I'll be a dead man. Hold on.
Let's cover it before we finish it.
Yeah, I definitely just need to share one more concept that's new. That we have now this visual query editor in the system. Because one thing that we had lots of requests is when doing those queries, how you can do that more visually. because to write those select statements can be quite tricky, especially when you start to combine two tables and define relationship between the tables. So the query statements, they can become quite complex, okay? And we do have now this button here, this embedded SQL query builder, which is that interface that allows you more easily to build those queries, one of the improvements on 90.1. And the documentation for that, if you go to our Taxoft documentation, if you search for Visual SQL Query Builder on what's new on 90.1, you have the step-by-step explanation how you can use this data mining tool. That was one of the major requests we had in previous versions, that the ability to create those queries and data mining more visually, browse the data. That's a very important topic.
Yeah, no, thank you for covering that.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, Marc, for taking the time to explain all that. And thank you to Shivendu and Alexander for your questions. Anyone that's tuned in, if you have additional questions, you can drop them at our forum at forum.tatsoft.com. And this recording will also be on our YouTube channel and as well as our LinkedIn company page. So next week, we will announce the topic probably on Tuesday. And also, I want to wish everyone stateside a happy Memorial Day this coming weekend. Anything on your side, Marc?
No, happy Memorial Day.
All right. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week. Take care. Bye.